Riverside Diner sat at the edge of a forgettable block in Houston, scratched tables, mismatched chairs, the smell of grilled meat drifting through a screen door that never quite closed all the way. It was the kind of place where no one pretended to be anything other than what they were. Natalie Weston had eaten here before, back when she was 22, and couldn't afford anything better. Now she was 34, quietly worth more than most people could count, and she still came back. Sometimes not for the food, but for the feeling of not having to perform. She sat across from her 5-year-old son, Cole, watching him arrange his fries into a straight line before eating them one by one. And for a couple of hours, she was just a mother having dinner with her kid. Until the door opened, and 2 strangers walked in and changed the shape of her whole year. The diner hummed with the quiet noise of a Tuesday evening, 2 old men at the counter arguing about baseball scores, a young woman near the window staring at a laptop screen, the cook calling out order numbers, in a voice that had long stopped trying to sound friendly. Natalie wore dark jeans and a plain gray cardigan, her hair pulled back without much care, no watch worth noticing. Cole sat across from her with a smear of ketchup on his left cheek, swinging both legs under the booth and explaining in full detail the plot of a cartoon she had never seen. She nodded at the right moments and watched his face, and thought, as she often did on evenings like this, that this was the best part of the whole week. The door opened with a soft jingle above the frame. A man walked in with a little girl perched on his back, one arm hooked under her knees, her small sneakers pressed against his side. He had brown hair tied back with a rubber band, jeans worn thin at the knees, and a navy jacket with a fraying cuff that he hadn't gotten around to fixing yet. The girl, maybe 5 years old, had her arms looped around his neck and her chin resting on his shoulder, taking in the diner with wide, steady eyes. They moved toward the counter together, the man setting her down carefully onto her feet before leaning in toward the server. His voice was low enough that it barely carried over the sound of the grill. He asked for a cup of coffee and a glass of water for the little girl. That was all. The server handed both over without a word. Derek Foster found a table in the back corner, near the wall, where the light was dim and the noise from the front didn't reach. He lifted his daughter Sadie onto one of the chairs and slid the glass of water toward her. She wrapped both hands around it and drank without being asked. He sat across from her with the coffee cup between his palms, watching the steam rise off the surface and disappear. He had not eaten since early morning, a job canceled by text message at noon, an afternoon of calls that went straight to voicemail, and a wallet with $11 in it had brought him here, where the coffee was hot, and no one looked at you sideways for taking up a table. Sadie's sneaker tapped the chair leg in a slow, patient rhythm. She was watching the woman and the small boy with the ketchup face at the booth by the window. Cole noticed her first. He stopped mid-sentence about the cartoon, tilted his head sideways, and looked at Sadie with the open, uncomplicated curiosity that only 5-year-olds are still allowed to show. She looked back at him without moving. Then Cole turned to Natalie and said with the seriousness of someone delivering important news that the girl at the corner table was hungry. Natalie looked up. She had not been watching, but now she did. She saw Derek's hands locked around the coffee cup. She saw Sadie's glass of water on the empty table. No food, no napkins spread in preparation, no server having come over to ask what else they needed. She saw a man who had ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and was sitting very still while his daughter drank water at 6:30 in the evening. Cole was already climbing off the bench before she said a word. He walked straight to the corner table with the easy confidence of someone who has not yet learned that kindness can embarrass people. He stopped in front of Sadie, said hello, and told her she could come eat with them because his mom had a lot of fries. Derek looked up sharply at the small voice in front of him. Before he could find the words to respond, Natalie was standing a few feet back, not rushing, not making it a scene. She understood right away that this man would not take charity wrapped in gentle language. She didn't try to offer it. She said the kids clearly wanted to share a table, that the booth was more than big enough, and that the food would only go cold otherwise. Her voice was calm, like it wasn't a decision at all, like she was simply arranging chairs. Derek said no twice. The second time, Sadie reached for the hem of his sleeve and held it in her fingers without saying a word. She didn't ask. She had learned somewhere along the way not to ask for too much. That silence, the particular patience of a child who has grown careful about hoping, pulled something loose in Derek's chest, and he said, "All right," quietly, almost to himself. They moved to the booth near the window. Natalie called the server over without ceremony and added a full dinner plate for Sadie, extra fries, a juice box, and a side of apple slices. She didn't look at Derek when she ordered, and she didn't make a point of it. Cole immediately produced the red toy car from his coat pocket and slid it across the table toward Sadie. She caught it in both hands and turned it over slowly, like it was something she needed to memorize before she could believe it was real. The two children ate and talked without stopping, trading the toy car back and forth, inventing rules for a game no one else would have understood. Natalie and Derek sat on their side of the table in an unusual quiet. He told her his name. She gave hers just Natalie, nothing added. He didn't ask what she did. She didn't ask why the coffee had been all he'd ordered. They talked around the edges of things the way people do when they haven't yet decided how much to trust each other. Natalie pushed the basket of fries toward him and said they were still hot. He ate without arguing. He was too hungry to argue. Sadie cleaned her plate slowly and carefully, the way someone eats when they've learned that second helpings are not guaranteed. When she pushed the empty plate away and took a long breath, Cole looked at her with pure satisfaction and offered her the rest of his apple slices. She shook her head, but her eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been 40 minutes before. When they stood to leave, Derek reached into his pocket and put some folded bills on the table, trying to cover Sadie's portion. Natalie kept one hand raised still and quiet until he put them away. He thanked her once and again at the door. Cole pressed the toy car into Sadie's hands as a gift, and she looked at her father for permission before taking it. Derek nodded. Sadie hugged Cole around the middle with her whole body and held on. Cole went stiff with surprise, then grinned at his shoes. They walked out into the evening, Derek with Sadie's hand in his. Sadie with the red car pressed against her chest. Natalie and Cole stood by the window and watched them move down the sidewalk until they turned the corner and were gone. Cole pressed one hand flat against the glass. Natalie put her arm around his shoulders, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The alarm went off at 5:15. Derek silenced it before the second ring sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark and pressed his feet against the cold floor. His body was tired in the way it always was, not the tiredness that goes away after sleep, but the kind that has moved in and stopped being a guest. He showered quickly, dressed in jeans and a clean flannel shirt, and tied his hair back. He checked his phone while the coffee maker ran. There was a message from a client who had booked him for a full day of cleaning on Thursday. Canceling something unexpected, had come up very sorry. Derek typed back that it was no problem, let him know if anything changed, and set the phone face down on the counter. That was the third cancellation in 2.5 weeks. He walked into Sadie's room and sat on the edge of her bed. She was curled toward the wall with one arm wrapped around an old stuffed bear that had lost most of its fur around the ears. He brushed the hair back from her face gently until she stirred. She opened her eyes and looked at him without full recognition for a second, then smiled the way children do when they wake up and find the person they were hoping for sitting right there. He helped her get dressed, made toast with peanut butter, poured a glass of milk, and waited for his neighbor, Mrs. Carroll, to arrive. She was 63 and lived 2 doors down, and had been watching Sadie on short notice for most of the past year, refusing every dollar he tried to give her and telling him to put it toward something the girl needed instead. She arrived at 6:45, came in without knocking, and told Derek to go find some work before the good jobs were already taken. He spent most of that morning on the phone working through a list of clients whose numbers he'd collected over 2 years of day cleaning work. Houses, offices, rental units being turned over between tenants. Some didn't answer. Some said they were fine. Right now they'd call him if anything came up. By noon he had one job scheduled for the following week, a half day at a house whose owner was preparing to list it. He took the bus to a part of town where a few property management companies operated, dropped off paper resumes at 2 of them, and stood on the sidewalk outside a third for a full minute before deciding it wasn't worth the conversation. On the way home, he stopped at the grocery store with careful attention to what each thing cost and put back a container of yogurt he'd already put in the basket. Sadie was drawing at the kitchen table when he came in. She showed him a picture of a house with a garden and a sun in the corner. She asked if they would have a house like that someday. He said yes, someday, and meant it as much as he could. The following Sunday, Derek took Sadie to the park. It cost nothing, and she deserved the air and the space, and honestly, so did he. Garfield Park was small, but well-kept a climbing structure. 2 sets of swings, wooden benches under old oak trees, a flat stretch of grass where kids ran in no particular direction for no particular reason. They arrived around 10 in the morning with 2 peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in foil and a water bottle they'd refilled from the sink at home. Sadie ran for the swings immediately. Derek sat on a bench and watched her pump her legs until the chain went tight at the top of the arc. Hair flying back, face open with joy that cost nothing and required nothing and needed nobody's approval. He ate his sandwich and felt for a few minutes like things were manageable. Sadie spotted them first. She jumped off the swing while it was still moving, which made Derek's heart lurch, and sprinted toward the far end of the park, calling a name. Derek stood up and searched the direction she was heading. There, near the climbing structure, was Cole holding a soccer ball, looking around as if he'd heard something. Beside him, in jeans and a worn green jacket, was Natalie. Sadie reached Cole, and the 2 of them crashed together like they'd been friends for years, which in the uncomplicated arithmetic of childhood, they had been for exactly 1 dinner. Natalie looked up and found Derek standing a few feet away. She lifted one hand in a small wave. He waved back and felt his face do something he hadn't planned. They sat on the same bench and watched the kids invent some new version of a game involving the soccer ball and a set of rules that changed every few minutes. The conversation came in careful pieces at first, where they grew up, how long they'd been in Houston, whether they liked the fall weather or missed the summer. Natalie said she'd grown up here and never really left, which she said with the mild self-awareness of someone who had thought about what that meant. Derek said he'd come from Ohio 8 years ago, looking for more work and more room, and that it had gone better in some ways and harder in others than he'd expected. Natalie didn't ask him to say more than he offered. He noticed that, and it loosened something in him enough to keep talking. She asked what he'd wanted to be when he was a kid. He said a teacher, then laughed at how long ago that felt. She said she'd wanted to be a firefighter. He looked at her. She was completely serious. They both laughed, and it was the first time he'd laughed like that in a while. After that, the park became a Sunday habit. Every week they arrived around the same time, settled on the same bench, and sat in the comfortable ease of people who have agreed without saying, so that this is where they belong on Sunday mornings. Natalie started bringing a bag with food sandwiches, with different fillings, cut fruit in a container, sometimes cookies. She said she and Cole had baked the day before. She always said she'd made too much. Derek always understood that she was lying, and he accepted the food with quiet gratitude because she offered it in a way that never made him feel reduced. The kids shared everything automatically without being asked. They had moved past the stage of being pleased by each other's company and had arrived somewhere that felt more like assumption, the easy assumption that the other would simply be there. One Sunday, the rain came down fast and heavy, the kind of sudden Houston downpour that is indifferent to your plans. Natalie looked at the sky, then at Derek, who was folding a jacket over Sadie's head and scanning the street for the bus stop. She said she'd drive them. He said she didn't need to. She said it would be 20 minutes before a bus came, and Sadie was already shivering, which was true. He said, okay. Her car was practical and quiet, nothing that drew attention, and she drove without talking much. Cole and Sadie talked steadily in the back seat, reviewing every game they'd played that morning in precise detail. When she pulled up in front of Derek's building, he thanked her, and she said, "Next time it rains, just assume the ride is already arranged." After that, it became part of the routine, and Derek stopped arguing about it, because the truth was that sitting beside her in the car, while the rain came down and the kids talked in the back, was one of the better parts of his week. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in November, sliding through the mail slot and landing on the floor with the particular flatness of something official. Derek picked it up on his way to the kitchen and set it on the table while he poured coffee, then opened it. The landlord was raising rent by $190 a month, effective in 60 days. Derek sat down with the letter in one hand and the coffee cup in the other and read it 3 times. The number didn't change. He opened the notebook where he kept his budget, written in pencil, rent, utilities, food, bus fare, Sadie's school supplies, and worked through the arithmetic slowly, the way he always did, hoping a different order of operations might produce a different result. It did not. He closed the notebook and sat for a while looking at the wall. In the same week, 2 long-term clients let him go. One said her daughter had moved back home and would handle the cleaning herself. The other said she'd found someone cheaper and was sorry about the timing. Derek thanked them both politely, wished them well, and stood on the sidewalk after each call, with the phone in his hand, running the new numbers in his head, and coming up short every time. He spent the weekend dropping off resumes at grocery stores and diners and a moving company he'd seen hiring in a window. No one called back by Monday. He kept the fear out of his face when Sadie was near him. At night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the bill spread out and let himself feel the weight of it for a while, because there was no point pretending it wasn't there. One afternoon, Natalie said something quietly while they were watching Cole and Sadie sort through a pile of leaves they'd collected. She said she had a few friends who always needed someone reliable for day work, cleaning, moving, turnover prep for rental properties, and that she'd be glad to give them his number if he was interested. Derek turned toward her. She was looking at Cole, not at him, her voice carefully matter-of-fact, as if she were suggesting something routine and unremarkable. He said yes. He said thank you so many times. She finally said his name in a tone that told him to stop. She texted his number to 3 people that afternoon, and by the following Wednesday, he'd had calls from all 3. They were kind, they paid on time, they gave clear instructions, and they called again the following month. For the first time in weeks, Derek sat down with his notebook and found that the numbers, while still tight, were not impossible. It was a Thursday in December when Derek took a 1-day cleaning job through a referral from one of Natalie's contacts, a large apartment on the 15th floor of a new building in the Galleria area, empty and being staged for sale. The building was marble and glass. The lobby had a ceiling that went up 30 feet, and the security guard at the front desk asked for his name and checked a clipboard before letting him through. Derek rode the elevator up to 15 and let himself into the apartment with the key the real estate agent Laura King had left at the desk. It was 3,000 square feet of empty white space, vaulted ceilings, long windows, looking south over the city. Tile floors, so new they still caught the light. Laura had explained the requirements in a text, spotless every surface top to bottom. Clients coming at 2. He changed into his work clothes, tied his hair back, and started in the kitchen. He was on his knees in the living room working a cloth along the baseboards when he heard the elevator open down the hall. He assumed it was Laura arriving early. The front door opened. A man in a charcoal suit walked in carrying a leather portfolio, speaking in a low, clipped voice to 2 assistants behind him. Then Natalie walked through the door. Derek went completely still. She was wearing a fitted dark suit, a white blouse with no wrinkles, low heels that made a precise sound on the tile. Her hair was smooth and pulled back, her expression focused and neutral in a way it never was at the park. She was on the phone, not looking at the room, yet talking about a closing window and a renovation budget ceiling in the way people talk about things they have decided before the conversation started. Her voice was different, not harder exactly, but firmer, moving forward without gaps. The group moved into the room slowly. The real estate agent began describing square footage and ceiling height. One of the assistants read numbers from a tablet. Natalie walked to the south window and looked out over the city without touching the glass, asking short, precise questions about renovation timelines and projected resale values. The numbers being discussed, hundreds of thousands renovation budgets, the margin between acquisition cost and resale, were spoken in the flat tone of people for whom those figures are not remarkable. Derek had pressed himself against the wall near the utility room door. None of them had noticed him yet. He was wearing old gray pants and a paint-stained shirt, crouched on the floor with a cleaning cloth and a bucket beside him, and it occurred to him with sudden, complete clarity that this was where he was, and that was where she was, and that these two facts could not be made into the same story. He waited until the group moved further into the hallway toward the bedrooms. Then he gathered his things, quickly cloth spray bottled the bucket, and let himself out through the service stairwell at the end of the hall. He went down 15 flights without stopping. By the time he pushed through the lobby door and into the cold air outside, his breathing was unsteady and his face was hot despite the temperature. He walked 2 blocks and stopped with his back against a brick wall, hands in his jacket pockets. He stood there for a while, not thinking in sentences, just standing there while the city moved past him like it always did, like he wasn't there at all. When he finally started walking again, it was in the direction of home, and the walk took 40 minutes because he missed his bus stop by 6 blocks and didn't notice. That evening, Natalie sent a text asking how his day had gone. He looked at the screen for a long time before typing back, "Busy, lots of work." She replied with a small acknowledgement and left it there. He did not text again that night. The following Sunday, he sent a message saying he had a job that was going all day and couldn't make it to the park. She said, "Okay, take care." Monday, she sent a short message asking if everything was all right. He read it 3 times and didn't reply until Wednesday, when he said yes, just a lot going on. She wrote back one line, "Okay, I'm here if you want to talk." He set the phone face down on the kitchen table and sat with his coffee going cold until Sadie called him from the other room. Cole asked about Sadie every day that week. He asked on Monday during dinner on Wednesday, in the car on the way to school, and on Friday, while Natalie was trying to finish a call in the kitchen. Each time she told him some version of the same thing, that Derek had work, that they'd see them soon, that sometimes things changed on short notice. Cole received each answer with a polite seriousness that told her he was not convinced. On Sunday, she and Cole went to the park alone, and he sat on the bench beside her for a while, without running off to the climbing structure, just kicking the toe of one sneaker against the ground before he finally said he missed Sadie. Natalie put her arm around him and said she did too. She meant it in a way that surprised her. She waited 3 weeks before going to his apartment. She had thought about calling again, and about leaving it alone, and about sending another message that would probably go unanswered. But 3 weeks of silence after months of easy, steady presence was not a scheduling problem. Something had shifted, and she needed to understand. What? On a Sunday morning, she put Cole in the car and drove to the address she had in her phone from the nights she'd driven them home in the rain. She told Cole to stay in the car for a few minutes, and that she'd be right back. He said, "Okay, Mom," with the patience of a child who has learned when to ask questions and when not to. She went into the building and knocked on apartment 304. She heard footsteps on the other side. A pause. Then the door opened. Derek looked at her without speaking for a moment. He was in old sweatpants and a plain t-shirt, his hair down, the expression of someone who had not been expecting to need to arrange his face into anything in particular. He said her name She said hi. He asked what she was doing there, and she told him she needed to talk to him. He said he was a little busy, and she said she knew, and she looked at him without moving, and eventually he stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door behind him. He crossed his arms. She put her hands in her jacket pockets. She asked him what had happened. He said he'd been busy. She told him she believed that he was busy, and that this was not the same thing as busy. He turned his face toward the wall. She told him she missed him, that she and Cole had both missed him, and Sadie, and that she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She asked if she'd said something wrong, if she'd done something that hurt him, without knowing it, and told him she wanted the chance to understand. He shook his head. He said no, she hadn't done anything wrong. She asked why he was pulling away then, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he told her about the apartment. He told her about the 15th floor, the suit, the renovation budget, the tile floor. He said he'd been there on his knees with a cleaning cloth, and she'd walked in talking about millions like it was the weather. His voice was even and low, the voice of someone who has already processed the shame and arrived on the other side of it at something harder and more honest. He said he understood something clearly in that moment about the distance between their two worlds, and that he had no business forgetting it. Natalie did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she sometimes looked at a set of numbers before she decided what they meant. Then she took one step toward him and said his name, and her voice was different now. Not the voice from the 15th floor, and not the careful, measured voice from the early park Sundays. It was the voice she used when she was not performing anything for anyone. She said she did not care what floor she'd been standing on, or what he'd been doing when she walked through that door. She said the thing that mattered to her, the only thing in the part of her life that was actually hers, and not a role she'd learned to play, was the person he was. She said she had watched him show up for his daughter every single week, under circumstances that would have bent most people without complaint, and without asking for anything from anyone, and that she found that extraordinary in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. Derek stood against the wall with his arms loose now at his sides, his eyes bright in a way that was uncomfortable to hold. He said he was scared. She asked what he was scared of. He said he was scared that he wasn't enough, not enough for this for her, for whatever it was that had been building between them slowly on Sunday mornings and rainy drives home, and afternoons in a park. She asked enough for who. He didn't answer. She stepped forward and put her arms around him. He stood still for a second, and then he hugged her back, his hands gripping the back of her jacket, and let his face drop against her shoulder. She held on. He held on. The hallway smelled like someone's dinner, and the building's old carpeting, and it was completely ordinary, and that was exactly what it needed to be. After a long moment, he straightened up and wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said he was sorry for disappearing. She told him he didn't owe her an apology. She said she just needed to understand what was happening between them, because she had also felt something shift in the weeks he'd been gone, and she needed to be honest with herself about what that meant. He said he thought he'd been starting to feel something more than just friendship, and that it had scared him enough to run. She said she already knew, because she'd felt the same thing, and she'd had to ask herself hard questions about why it hurt as much as it did when he pulled away. They stood in the plain hallway and looked at each other with the relief of two people who have finally said the thing they've been thinking about for a long time. Cole was still in the car. Derek went inside and told Sadie to put her shoes on because she had visitors. She said Leo's name first, and then caught herself and said Cole's name, and went to find her sneakers in approximately 4 seconds flat. Cole came through the front door, and he and Sadie greeted each other, the way they always did, like the absence had been much longer than 3 weeks, and also like no time had passed at all. They disappeared into Sadie's room immediately. Natalie sat on the couch. Derek made coffee, and they sat together without filling all the space with words, and it was easy in a way that felt like coming back to something rather than starting something new. The following week, Natalie came by on a Saturday with a box wrapped in brown paper. She set it on the coffee table and told Sadie she'd brought something for her. Sadie looked at her father, who nodded. She sat cross-legged on the floor and unwrapped it with the careful concentration of a child who treats small rituals with appropriate seriousness. Inside the box was a pair of sneakers, white with pale pink detail along the sole, clean and soft, and exactly her size. Sadie held them in her lap and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at Natalie with an expression that was too complete to summarize, and she climbed up onto the couch and put her arms around Natalie's neck and cried the way children cry when something good happens that they hadn't let themselves expect. Natalie held her and rubbed her back and said she was very glad they fit. Derek stood by the kitchen doorway with his hand pressed against the frame, looking at the ceiling for a moment before he looked back at the two of them. A few weeks after that, on a Sunday afternoon in early December, when the weather had softened back into something almost warm, the four of them spread a blanket in Garfield Park for the last outdoor afternoon of the season. Cole and Sadie ran between the trees, inventing games neither adult could follow. The light came through the oak sideways in that late fall way that makes everything look like it costs more than it does. Derek and Natalie sat on the blanket close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. She turned toward him after a while and said she wanted to tell him something. He said, "Okay." She looked at her hands for a moment before looking at him, and then she said that after her husband died, she had closed herself off so thoroughly she had stopped noticing it. She said she had gotten very good at keeping things working, the company, the money, Cole's life, the routine, and she had mistaken that competence for being all right. She said he and Sadie had walked into a diner on a Tuesday night and started pulling her back toward something she had stopped believing she was still capable of feeling. Derek reached over and took her hand. She let him. He turned toward her on the blanket and told her that he had come to Houston 8 years ago, believing that if he just worked hard enough and stayed steady, things would eventually level out into something livable. He said it had taken him a long time to understand that steady wasn't the same as safe, and that working hard alone didn't protect you from the kind of tiredness that came from doing everything by yourself all the time. He said that on the Sundays she was there, and on the rainy drives home, and in the evenings when she texted just to ask how the day had gone on. All of those occasions, something in him had unclenched that he hadn't known was still clenched. He said she made him feel less invisible. He stopped there because what he meant was bigger than what he had the words for, and she knew that. And she nodded. She said, "I love you." She said it the way people say true things, when they have stopped being afraid of them clearly without build-up looking at him directly. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said it back. He said, "I love you too," and he meant it in the full weight of the phrase, not as a courtesy or a reflex, but as an accounting of what had actually happened to him over the past several months. The park, the fries, the rainy drives, the pink sneakers, the hallway outside apartment 304, the conversation about firefighters and toy cars, and what it felt like to be seen. Cole came running back toward the blanket at that moment, breathless, to report that Sadie had climbed the highest branch of the oak tree and would not come down. Derek called Sadie's name in a voice that was trying to be stern and failing completely. Sadie appeared from behind the tree unconcerned and announced that she had seen a bird up close. The four of them sat together on the blanket while the light dropped lower through the trees. They packed up as the sun finished going down, folding the blanket together, the way families do, each person taking a corner. Sadie held one end and tried to match the folds with the concentrated effort of someone learning a new skill. Cole held the other end and waited with unusual patience for her to get it right. On the drive home, Derek drove, and Natalie sat beside him with her hand resting on the center console, and he covered it with his own. Cole and Sadie talked about everything they'd done that afternoon in the specific, exhaustive way that children recap events as if no one else was there for them. Natalie looked in the mirror at the two small people in the back seat, both of them rosy-cheeked and unhurried. Sadie still holding the red toy car that had started everything. She leaned her head back against the seat and let out a slow breath. Derek glanced at her and asked how she was feeling. She said, "Better than I've felt in a very long time." He said, "Me too." And outside the windows, the city moved past in the ordinary way that cities do, lit up and indifferent and beautiful in the usual fashion, carrying all its people home. Some things begin without announcing themselves. A diner on an unremarkable Tuesday, a table in the back corner, a boy with a toy car, and a girl who had never been given one. Two people who sat down across from each other with the careful distance of strangers, and over the slow accumulation of Sundays and packed lunches and rides home in the rain, stopped being strangers without quite noticing when it happened. Derek had come to that diner because he had $11 and a daughter who was hungry, and nowhere else to be. Natalie had come because she wanted for a few hours to be just a person having dinner with her kid. Neither of them had been looking for anything. But something found them anyway in the uncalculated space between a shared plate of fries and a small red car changing hands, and it turned out to be exactly what they had, both in their separate exhaustions, quietly needed. That is how it usually goes when it goes well. Quietly, slowly, without any announcement at all.